We're going to go to the book of Daniel. I mentioned Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, and you probably didn't recognize those names. Hopefully now you do, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Interesting thing about, doesn't have a whole lot to do with the story, but interesting thing about that, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah was their Jewish name, but we know them by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their Babylonian names. Whereas Daniel, we know only by his, we know him by his Jewish name and not his Babylonian name of Belteshazzar, which is trivial. But that actually comes up in the first chapter, and that's what we're going to start out. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Notice who was doing the work there. God gave his people into captivity. We've been talking about that in the last few weeks in our Sunday morning Bible class. So time-wise, we are now at the Babylonian captivity. It is now happening. It's been talked about in these other books we've been studying. It is now actually happening. They are going into captivity. And in the process, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and he brought some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and brought the vessel into the treasury of his God. And the king ordered, I'll skip that word, the chief of his officials to bring some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and the nobles, the youths in whom were no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, however you want to refer to that. Even though I'm old, I wasn't old enough to know Nebuchadnezzar, but if you read the book of Daniel, you'll learn pretty quickly that Nebuchadnezzar was a little full of himself. He was basically an egotistical person, and if you want to, you could even call him a narcissist. You can look that up in the dictionary or Google the term and find out exactly what a narcissist is. He loved attention. He loved to have people praise him and tell him how great he was. He had the statue, which was approximately 90 foot tall, that a gold statue put out so that the people would all bow down and worship him, like Donovan was talking about. That was the whole point of mighty King Nebuchadnezzar, ruler of the world. Actually, it was a world empire at that time. This was the mentality of Nebuchadnezzar. This was what the children of Israel were walking into. And they would be rewarded. As you read in chapter 1, they would get fine food and they'd be well taken care of. Minor little kicker, they just had to fall down and worship Nebuchadnezzar and his idol. There were some individuals there that didn't go along with this totally. And you can imagine how that set with King Nebuchadnezzar. When a narcissist has somebody refuse to honor them or refuse to acknowledge their greatness, they get a little upset. And that's exactly what happened in verse 13 of chapter 3. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and in anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These three men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now notice this, he gives them a second chance. He's cutting them some slack here. Now if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, and the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, if you're willing to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you will not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Notice, out of my hands. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said, to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of the blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." You can imagine how well that set Nebuchadnezzar. You can imagine how he responded to that. He was already full of anger and rage, and then for them in front of everybody to say, we're not going to bow down and worship this image. We have our God, who is the creator and sustainer of the universe. Our God is the God. There are no others. No, we're not going to bow down and worship. Well, he was a little ticked off, as you might imagine, and so he would proceed to build a fire. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and his facial expressions were altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated, 7 times what the furnace was already supposed to be. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who came up with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So even the guys attending them, when they got close enough to the furnace that was 7 times hotter than normal, they died. They were burnt. So now you've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the fiery furnace, and they're all bundled up in their clothes. They all just burst into flames, just like the servants of Nebuchadnezzar who were bringing them up. Like I said, when I committed to this short sermon, I thought, sounded like a good idea at the time. But as I was working on it this week, I got to this point and I thought, good grief, I'm just barely getting started in this story. There's no way that I'm going to be able to get to the good part. Because if y'all know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you know the good part that comes up. You know what the good part is, right? And then it hit me. Maybe this is the good part. Maybe this is the important part. Maybe what happened at the end isn't important at all. Maybe that's incidental. Maybe the message of Daniel chapter 3 is really up to this point right now. If you've read this before, if you've sat through Bible class, if you're old enough, you know what a flannel graph is. You probably saw a flannel graph. There's cool ones. Back in the 60s, we actually added fluorescent lighting to that and used black light, and it was really, really cool to see the flames. But we love this story. We get excited about this story. And Nebuchadnezzar says, throw him into the fire. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, no, we're not going to serve you. Our faith is in our God. How many of you, show of hands, how many of you think they actually thought that they would not burn up in the fire? Let me go back and read a verse. Verse 17. I intentionally skipped over verse 18. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. At the very least, there was some degree of doubt in their mind. In fact, my guess is if there was any thought in their mind that they were going to be spared in the fire, that went up in flames. Sorry, the pun. That went up in flames when the Nebuchadnezzar's attendants went up in flames. That's the message. That's the message. Even if faith. Even if faith. How many times do we rely upon the end of the story to, well, tell me how it worked out. Tell me how it played out. Tell me what's going to happen. No, that's not the point. The point is, my faith is in God even when I know I'm going to burn, when I'm going to go up in flames, when I'm going to die. If you'll notice the bulletin on the front of it, theme, live like you are dying. And in fact, if you go to the Community with God on Wednesday, I suggest that you listen to a song. It's actually a song by Tim McGraw, Live Like You Were Dying. It's a country song. It is not a church song or religious song or anything like that. But it is a song I would ask that if you can pull it up on Alexa or Spotify or just Google it, listen to it and think about the message. Live like you are dying. If you knew that you were dying, if you knew that you only had a few hours or a few days, how would you live your life? Would it be any different than what you are living it right now? You see, I don't think Shadrach and Meshach had the great assurance that they were going to come out smelling Downy Clean. Is that the one? To come out of the fire, to not even have the smoke on there. You read the story, you see how this comes out. You see how this plays. But for them, they didn't know that. They didn't know the rest of the story. And then the key in this is it didn't make them any difference. It didn't make them any difference. What if God doesn't spare you? We can go to Hebrews chapter 11 and we can read the great story of the men and women of faith in the New Testament. We get down here, what more shall I say then, for time will fail me. I'm watching time. Will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from the weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women who received back their dead. Yeah, I'm on God's side. I believe in God. But let's keep going. They were they were tortured, not accepting their release in order that they might obtain a better resurrection. Others experienced mocking, scourging, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put in faith with the sword, put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskin and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. Men of whom, and I'll put men and women here because I think that's the generic term there, of men and women who this world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground, and all these having gained approval throughout their faith, did not receive what was promised. That's faith. That's faith. Hebrews 11 is a list of names that we all recognize. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could be in there. Daniel could be in there. All of these names of people we recognize, most all of which had great success stories and did some phenomenal things. And we said, yeah, God, sign me up for that team because I know you're going to win the national championship, or I know you're going to be, everything's going to be great. But what if that doesn't play out the way I think it does? Do you have even if faith? Do you have even if faith to be sawn asunder? Do you have even if faith to have other family members sacrificed and then sacrificed yourself? Even if faith is not contingent upon the expectation of what we hope for, it's contingent entirely on a vertical relationship with our God and our Savior. That's a little bit different. So go back to this idea of live like you were dying. I think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and many of these people who don't know their names in Hebrews chapter 11, they lived like they were dying. Why? Because they were. Not to be morbid. My daddy had an expression growing up. He said, from the moment you're born, you begin to die. And I always thought, as a teenager, I thought, well, how depressing. That's not something you say at a birthday. You know. But the more I think about it, the truer that is. That's our destiny. We're not going to get out of this alive. Live like you're dying. Would you live your life any differently? Would you live your life like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with even if faith of, I don't care what happens, it's me and God. He's got me all the way. Do you have that type of faith? Jesus Christ gave us the perfect example. That's exactly how Jesus lived his life. He knew from the get-go he was going to die. Knew it was not going to be a pleasant thing, and he knew he was going to be undeserving. But he lived a life, perfect example of faith. Faith not in his own human abilities, but a faith of a Father who loved him and cared for him. As I mentioned in the bulletin, the section on community with God, if you want to, you can go ahead and finish reading the book of the third chapter, Daniel, and find out what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you don't already know that. There's another story in there that's scheduled for Thursday's reading, Esther chapter 4. Very similar type situation with Queen Esther. You can read that story. If you want to read the whole story, you want to just stick with the good part. She said almost the exact same thing as what's being conveyed in the song on Wednesday. If you would listen to that and live like you were dying, I would not recommend writing a bull named Fu Manchu, as it talks about in the song, but there's an awful lot of other things that are very appropriate. How would you live your life? How would you live your life if you knew that you were dying? Several years ago, Charles Swindoll wrote a book. So You Want to Be Like God, I believe is the title. So you want to be like Jesus, I mean. I lost my notes, but that's okay. So you want to be like Jesus. If it were me, whenever I say the title of that book, it's, so, you want to be like Jesus? Are you sure you want to be like Jesus? Or you want to be a follower of Jesus, or do you want to be like Jesus? Now you might say, well, Dwight, you're just being cynical. No, I think I'm being realistic. Because when Jesus began his ministry, he knew how it was going to end. But he didn't say anything to the people about the last chapter. Or the climax, I shouldn't say the last chapter, because the last chapter is yet to come. He didn't tell them the rest of the story. Do you honestly think that if Jesus had come and started out his ministry, he said, okay, guys, I just want you to know the end of this story is that I'm going to get crucified on a cross and I'm going to die? How many people do you think would have followed him? How many people do you think would have said, sign me up for that, I want to be like Jesus? No, I don't think they would, because as humans, we don't look at the big picture, we look at it, what's in it for me? What's the end of the story that's going to be exciting, that's wonderful? Yes, I love a good success story. Well, this was a success story, but it was a different kind of success story. And the interesting thing about it is when they came to Jesus, they came to his disciples. Let me get over here to that. John chapter 12. They came and they wanted to see Jesus. Sirs, we would see Jesus. Jesus was just now at this point beginning to let the cat out of the bag. And so the message that he gave them when they wanted to see Jesus was, truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains by itself alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who loves his life loses it, and he who hates his life in this world shall keep it to life eternal. If anyone serves me, let him follow me. Where I am, there shall my servant also be. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. Now my soul has become troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? For this purpose that I came to this hour. Father, glorify thy name. Therefore came a voice out of heaven. I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. So you want to be like Jesus? Well, this is what you have to follow. Will you die to yourself? Will you die to your hold on this world? Will you die to the success stories of things need to turn out my way, that everything has got to be hunky-dory, we used to say? Or will I walk into the flames as people are bursting into flames around me? Will I walk into the fires with God and trust in Him? In the case of Daniel, will I walk into a lion's den with God? In the case of the unnamed people, will I take this wherever God calls me? Is that the faith that you have? The invitation, the benediction, is that this week, think about living like dying. Living like you're dying, because you are. You are. But that's what we're called to as Christians, to die. To die to this world, to die to ourselves. If you have any needs at this time, we have men and women available back in the chapel area, or you can come down front. We're always welcome to talk to you about baptism and get you into the watery grave so that you can receive the cleansing of your sins. But it all is contingent upon, do you have even if faith? Will you follow God even if? Think about that while we stand and while we sing.